Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to have you back if you attend the first two webinars on the use of cash for nutrition. So today we'll be focusing on a tool, very interesting tool called NutVal, which is a spreadsheet application for planning and monitoring food assistance. So before we talk a bit more about it, a bit of housekeeping. If it's your first time joining this type of webinar, for non-English speaker, you will have translation available if you just click, as you can see on the back, on the little hearth sign, and you will have translation in French and Spanish and Arabic. La traduction est disponible pour les francophones en cliquant sur le petit icône interprétation en bas de votre écran. And sorry, my Spanish and Arabic are not good enough for this translation. Next slide. So again, we are doing this webinar with the generous support of several donors, USAID, IRISH-Aid, UNICEF, and Canada. But it's also thank you to our great facilitator coming from different backgrounds, including Save the Children, UNICEF, USAID, UCL, etc. Next. So this webinar is actually the third webinar of a series of webinars with the purpose of trying to understand how we calculate the transfer value. As you know, healthy eating is not only a question of knowledge and perception, it's also a question of cost. And sometimes practitioners might struggle saying like, okay, but how much does it cost to eat healthy? A few weeks ago, we had a webinar on the cost of diet, which is a separate methodology to understand a bit more again what is the cost when you want to eat healthy. We will again present the difference between cost of diet and NutVal, and this, as of today, is really focusing on NutVal. Next. So as I said, this is the third session of a webinar, and we are hoping that you will enjoy it as much as you did enjoy the previous two webinars. If you are not able to attend the two previous webinars, let us know, and we will share the link and the recording with you. Next. So what are we going to talk about today? So today, as every time, we have lot of content, but we really, really want this section to be as interactive as possible. So please get yourself a nice cup of coffee and let us know what you think. Ask questions. You have the Q&A box if you want to ask questions. Don't hesitate to speak out. So there will be, I just finished with the introduction. There would be a presentation of the difference between cost of diet and NutVal. We will try to understand what is NutVal. There will be live demonstration because we really want to show you everything we can do with this tool. We will try to do a case study, and actually we will try to make it as realistic as possible. We will expect you to contribute, to tell us how we can move forward, and we will try to see what is the future of NutVal, because there's a fifth version coming soon, and we will really value your feedback, so how to make it even greater as it already is. And of course, we will end with the Q&A session and the closing. Again, don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A. Please introduce yourself in the chat box. Again, don't ask questions in the chat box because we might not see them. If you want to ask questions, use the Q&A. And I will now introduce the great people we have today with us for this facilitation. So myself, I am Diane Moyer. I'm a nutrition advisor for Worldwide Concern, and I concern Worldwide, and I'm also the co-lead of the Global Technical Working Group on the use of CVA for nutrition outcome. Now I'm going to introduce my co-lead, Marina Tripaldi. Marina, if you may want to say a couple of words.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marina Tripaldi. I'm the other co-chair of the Cash and Voucher Working Group under the Global Nutrition Cluster, and very happy to be with you today. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Marina. And our two great facilitators today. So ladies first, we will have Maggie Holmes-Sharan. Maggie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Holmes-Sharan, and I'm a nutrition advisor with USAID and the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and also a member of the Cash and Voucher Working Group for the GNC. Nice to see you all here.
Thank you, Maggie. And last but not least, Andrew, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you. I'm Andy Seal, based at University College London Institute for Global Health, and also a member of the working group. Diane.
Thank you, Andrew. And don't run away, because I'm gonna hand it over to you for the next session. Thank you, everyone. And again, don't hesitate to ask questions and contribute. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. So as mentioned for the agenda, the first thing we want to do is just briefly recap on the comparison between the cost of diet tool and NutVal. Next slide, please. So also, it's important to mention, of course, that these two are not the only tools that can be used. For example, WFP have been developing enhanced software, for example. There's a range of different commercial nutrition software and online databases you can look at. And of course, users will also have designed their own spreadsheets. So there's a range of different tools, but in the seminar series, we've concentrated on cost of diet and NutVal. Next slide, please. So this is a quick table to summarize the differences between those two software packages that we've focused on. And both of them, as you see, have new versions coming up. And this, as Dan mentioned, is a really important opportunity for us today to try and get feedback from you as users or potential users about what you would like to see in the next version. So they both have advantages and disadvantages. Cost of diet is a much stronger tool for some purposes, such as coming up with an optimized diet at minimum cost, whereas NutVal is more designed for use in humanitarian contexts where calculations have to be done more quickly and without the necessarily the opportunity to collect a lot of supporting data. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, the focus today, of course, is on the use of the tool for the calculation of CVA transfer values that may be needed to achieve a nutritionally adequate diet. And we are going to ask for your participation in a series of polls so we can get feedback from you, and hopefully you'll also feel a little bit more involved in the seminar. Next slide, please. So this is the first Zoom poll, and I'm going to, or Sanjay in a second will share the poll for you, and here it is. That's great. So hopefully you will now be seeing the poll appear on your screens. I'm going to read the questions so the translators are able to translate for the other language speakers in the audience. So the first question is, have you ever used NutVal in your work? And the available responses are never, never, occasionally, or often. Question 2 is, have you ever received training on how to use NutVal? And the responses are never received training, did some training a long time ago, or did some training recently. And the third and last question is, what level of user do you think you are? Are you a beginner, intermediate, or expert user? Great, we've got up to quite a good response rate now, so over 85%, so pretty good response rate for a survey. They're still coming in though, so maybe just give it a couple of more minutes or a couple of more seconds, Sanjay. Okay, we seem to have stopped around there. Maybe we could end the poll and share the results. Great, thanks very much. So we can see that the majority have actually never used this software in the tool, and most people have never received any training but we do have some beginner users and some intermediate users, but no one who is, or I don't think we have anyone. Oh, we do actually. We have 4% who consider themselves to be expert users. So thanks very much for sharing the poll results, and that's very helpful as we go forward. Next slide, please. So we wanted to start now by just giving you an overview of the current version of NutVal, which is NutVal 4.1. So what is it and what's it designed to do? So it's a spreadsheet application developed in Excel for the planning and monitoring of the nutritional value of food assistance. So it was designed to try and make the job of program managers, nutritionists, and health staff easier and more effective, and aims to ensure that nutritionally adequate food assistance is provided. And it was developed initially particularly with a focus on micronutrient malnutrition. Next slide, please. So it has four main functions. It has a database of food items. It has a ration calculator, a logistics calculator, and a feature for ration tracking. And we'll show you those briefly in a second. It also has an on-site distribution monitoring function, which we won't share today. And we actually think it's probably not often used at all. And we may be retiring that in version 5, but it'd be good to get your feedback on that as well. Next slide, please. So the software is available from nutval.net. It's a freeware, so it can be downloaded easily. And there's a couple of animation points now, I think. So Kate, if you could just advance, thank you. Once the file has downloaded, you do have to ensure that macros are enabled. It is an Excel spreadsheet, and the code that makes it work is called Visual Basic for Applications, VBA code, or macros, and you do have to make sure that macros are enabled. And this can cause issues on some software systems, and some IT departments do not like that very much. So it's also worth noting that on the download page on the NutVal website, there are training PowerPoints available in English and French. So if you did want to have a look at this software more in depth, there are those available. Next slide, please. So once you open NutVal, this is the home page, and the next animation shows these are the function buttons that you have for those 5 functions I previously discussed. And also we have another couple of animations coming up. We have links to help pages, and we also have a button we can click to get a better screen view. Next page, please. This is the database. So in here, we'll find a limited number of food items, and there are plans to increase this size of the database. And we can show all the available items and sort them by name. We can filter them by category, and we can look at, for example, which ones have the highest vitamin A content. So that's the database, and that will remain pretty much similar in this current and the next version. Next slide, please. So we now have a quick Zoom poll before we move on to the live demo. And so Sanja, perhaps you could share the poll, please. And the question is, have you ever used the NutVal food basket monitoring or on-site distribution monitoring functions in your work? The possible responses are: didn't know they were there, they are not useful for me, I have used them occasionally, or I use them often and find them useful. So as the results coming in, we can see that most people didn't know they were there. But of course, quite a lot of us today haven't actually used the software. So that's obviously not surprising. But I think even probably among more regular users, it may well not be known. But there are a few people who use them regularly and find them useful. So that's a bit of a surprise finding. Okay, thanks. Oh, just a couple more coming in. Okay, thanks, Sanjay. Maybe we can close the poll now. Thank you. And next slide, please, Kate. So we're now just going to switch to just give you a quick live demo of NutVal. So I'm just going to stop sharing my video, and I think Kate is going to allow me to share my screen. So we're just going to switch over, and now hopefully you can see the NutVal screen. I just wondered if Diane, if you could confirm you can see the NutVal 4 version screen.
Yeah, we can
Thank
see.
you. Brilliant, thanks. So this is the homepage for NutVal version 4.1, which is the current version. And as I've already sort of indicated the functions in the previous slides, I'm just going to go now to the ration calculator. So this is the bit that most people use the most. It's an individual ration calculator. And as you can see here, in this case, we have selected the whole population group as our population of interest. And once we've done that, we see that we have a default value of 2,100 kilocalories as our target energy content. We can increase or decrease that using these up or down arrows here. We can also select other population groups. For example, we could select adult males, and we can see then, of course, they have a much higher nutrient requirements than the general population. So once we've selected our group and we've decided if we're going to try and reach 100% of that requirement, we can then add items here. We can clear the database, or rather the calculation screen, and we can load examples. And then we can also add in additional items that we may wish to from a drop-down screen, or by copying and pasting from the food database. Once we've selected these, then we can then change the amounts of the items in grams per person per day. And this is then reflected in the nutrient content and the percentage adequacy of the ration that we achieve. As you can see at the moment, the screen is just displaying energy, protein, fat, and minerals. If we click this button here, the View Vitamin button, we can then see the information on energy and the range of vitamins that are contained. As you can see, there are some problem nutrients with this ration. For example, we're only being able to supply 55% of nutritional requirements for vitamin B12 with this ration at the moment. Once we've selected a ration, we can then save it if we like. For example, I'll call this ration here the GNC seminar ration today. And once we've saved it, we can then, it will then appear on our saved ration list, and we can load it as we wish or delete it. So for example, I'm just going to delete one of those rations to show you what happens. Now, of course, we don't have no information at the moment on what that ration would cost and how to convert it into a cash transfer value. What we do have in the current version is the logistics calculator, which allows us to transform or recalculate what that individual ration would look like. For example, here, if we had a beneficiary population of 10,000 and we wanted to run the program for 12 months. So those can be calculated. And in these columns here, we can include costs for the food transfer. But at the moment, there's no capability to really use this directly to calculate transfer values for a CVA. So to do this, we would probably best be then to export the data using this button here. And once we've exported the data, it would then appear in a spreadsheet, which looks like this. And this is just a stripped down version of the NutVal with just the basic information on the amount and the nutrient content. And this can then be used in the actual calculation, which is what Maggie is going to talk about now in a hypothetical real world example. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and Kate, back to you. So next slide, please. And Maggie, over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope that this example that we're going to work through together will give you a little bit more of a feel for how you might make decisions in a real life programming situation. And so this scenario is a collection of several different examples that we've had globally. And yeah, I hope that that you find it interesting. Sorry, let me turn my video on so you can see me talking also at the same time. That might be helpful. Okay, so welcome to Yum Yum Land. Yum Yum Land is a fictitious theoretical country where you have been working for the last couple of years as a nutritionist. There's been a lot of displacement because there's been a massive political crisis, and the displacement has been going on for many, many years. The places that people have been displaced to have markets that are working. Lots of different humanitarian services are being provided, and a lot of the cash food assistance is provided through a cash or voucher modality for general food assistance at the household level. So in spite of all of this going on, you are noticing that the minimum diet diversity scores are really continuing to be poor for populations that you're really interested in. So small children, pregnant and breastfeeding women and girls, they have routinely poor diet adequacy numbers for MDD. And you know that there's nutritionally diverse foods in the market. So you're like, what is going on and what could we do differently? So what kind of options might you have for improving diet adequacy? You can please use the chat to provide some suggestions. I'll wait for a few things to come in the chat and then we'll move to the next one. What might you do to improve diet adequacy for women and children in this situation? So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. You could give more cash, yes. You can give social behavior change and cash, good, yep. Lots of SBC, yes. So if you're already doing SBC, then what's the gap that you're trying to fill? So you start to think about, you've heard that other people are using, in other contexts, are using cash or vouchers, like fresh food vouchers, to improve diet adequacy. And so you start to think about this. So you're like, right now we want to focus on pregnant and breastfeeding women and girls, and we're going to try to use some value vouchers to move the needle on the nutrition issues that we're seeing. But then as you start to think about this, you're like, what exactly is missing nutritionally? We know that MDD is a measure of diet adequacy, but it's not a measure of nutritional substance. And so you get together a group of interested stakeholders, and you're going to use the NutVal tool to see what nutrients and like micronutrients, macronutrients, and key minerals might be missing from those diets, just as a starting place to get you thinking about whether or not this idea of a value voucher is reasonable. So you're going to make the assumption that the woman in question receives an equal share of the household level food resources. Maybe this is true, maybe it isn't. But when you have to look at a food ration to see what is actually there, it's if it's a household ration that's given with a presumed family size of 5, then you just divide by 5. So that's a first assumption that you're going to make. And the second assumption that you're going to make is that the food assistance that they're receiving through the minimum expenditure basket for the general food assistance is already a least cost option, that it's been calibrated to be really affordable and to maximize nutrients for cost, given the market circumstances. So we're going to use that illustrative basket, even though we know that if they receive cash for household food assistance, they might not buy exactly what's already in the basket, but we're just going to assume that that's the cheapest thing that they could buy. So if they're optimizing it, that they're going to buy what's presumed to be in that illustrative basket. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So first, what we have to do is use NutVal to figure out what is and isn't there in the household level food ration. So you've taken this ration, it has rice, beans, oil, peanuts, salt and sugar, some maize meal, and some palm oil also, because that's relevant for your context in Yum Yum Land. And you divide by 5 for what the household level transfer is supposed to purchase, and you get a daily ration per day for this person. And so then, as Andy noted, at the bottom, on the bottom left side, you change the drop down to be for a lactating individual, and that gives you what they need for the day to see if it's meeting their kilocaloric requirements in the ration. Okay, so across the bottom, basically, the nice thing about NutVal is that it's color coded, so you can really look across just at a glance and see that this ration is not meeting almost any of the macro or micronutrient requirements. So this first page that you're looking at is macronutrients and key minerals. And then if you can go to the next slide, please. The next slide shows us all of the vitamins. Okay, so we're red, like all the way across the way. So then we go ahead and go to the next slide. So we show here that the diet currently, if we're trusting the MEB to provide the diet, is lacking. It's lacking in kilocalories. It doesn't meet sphere standards for minerals and all the micronutrients. So it's deficient completely across the board. So the first question would be, can we just provide more of the same foods or other foods needed? And so what we're going to do next is we need to find out if we just increase our assumptions about them buying these dry, commodities that are in the existing basket, would that meet the nutritional gaps that are there? And we also need to figure out what foods are available in the markets that could meet these gaps. So in order to find out market information, there's lots of different ways you could go. Some countries have a national statistical organization that regularly collects market data. They may have some information on some of these foods. You can use a pre-existing data set. So there might have been a recent cost of the diet done, which does an extensive market survey as a part of the conversation, so that you could use that information. You could do your own survey to collect price data. If you're doing regular price monitoring for a general food assistance basket, then you could use those same data enumerators and the same process to gather information on other commodities. And the last and my most favorite one is ask the people who work in your program who are from the area what they might suggest. If you think that there is a need for more animal protein in the diet, B vitamins, then what do your program staff think would be appropriate? What's culturally appropriate for pregnant and breastfeeding women and girls in that context? So you can get a lot of good ideas from people who really already know the nutritional landscape of the place as well. Okay, so please go to the next slide. So this is our first, to check the box of the first question. If we increase what's in the ration just using the existing items, we get to adequacy on some things. Like you could get it up to meeting the macronutrient requirements, enough protein, enough fat. You can do that using those existing items. And you get to adequacy on some of the minerals, but not all of them, like it's still lacking calcium. Go to the next slide, please. And then this one is the vitamins. So you see you got some green in here. You get to some more adequacy on some of the vitamins, just upping those like dry food commodities that you're already doing market monitoring for, and you already have vendors for. But you're not getting everything. You still have some red sections in here, and some of them are quite low, like some are 0 or less than 50. Okay, so then we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So then what we have, I apologize, the screenshot I put in here is not super clear, but what we have here is you've also gone ahead and done some market monitoring. And so what you have here is a list of commodities that you know are available in the area. And then you have an average price per 100 grams, and then the range. So this can tell you like how much variability there is in the existing market for these different key foods that you could potentially choose to add to your basket. Okay, so go ahead and go to the next slide. So what we're gonna do, we figured out that just adding more of the same food still leaves some food gaps. And we know that there are other nutrient-rich foods available in the market. So now what we need to do is make a basket, an add-on basket that tacks on to that existing general food assistance basket that meets nutrient gaps, that's reasonable considering local diet preferences, and that isn't too expensive, okay? So we need to do this remembering that the basket is intended to be illustrative. We're not assuming that everybody is going to buy exactly what we put in the basket, but what we're doing is making a case for what is reasonably affordable in the context given actual availability. And the second point that's very important to remember is that it holds all else equal, our assumptions that we're making here. So we're presuming that there's not going to be any changes in the composition or the coverage of the MEB. So it means that the MEB, they're not going to add extra peanuts to the MEB or extra oil, or they're not going to change from a 70% coverage of the transfer to a 50%. We're just going to hold on to it as it is right now in order to develop the basket. And then later it can be recalibrated as needed. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And so then here you can see how the color running across the bottom changes when we make shifts in the actual composition of the basket. So we have all of the same items at the top: rice, beans, oil, palm oil, maize, all of these things, but we've added some key nutritionally dense foods. We've added dark green leafy vegetables, some dried fish, which is appropriate in the context, some fresh meat, a vitamin C rich item. There's some goat milk added there, eggs, and then banana as well. And so based on this, we can see that we're able to push the kilocalories and the kilocalorie balance as well as the minerals. And then next slide, please. Here are the vitamins. So we got to green on almost everything. Little over on vitamin K with our dark green leafy vegetables, but we'll take it. Generally in a real life situation, you're not going to get to like a perfect range on every single thing. So you have to make some compromises. But generally, you can see an overall trend moving in the direction of more nutrient adequacy. Okay, so next slide, please. So then we have this basket that's looking good nutritionally. We've talked to the people that we work with in the field. They're like, yeah, this is reasonable. People in Yum Yum land like to eat these foods. and these are acceptable foods for the target group we're talking about. And then we need to figure out what is it going to cost us, right? Because that's ultimately the bottom line when you're trying to design a program that the donor is going to decide whether or not they want to fund. You're trying to be really, really cost effective. So how we have this basket, how are we going to cost it, right? So as Andy said in his demo, right now, the current version of NutVal doesn't have the ability to run a costing analysis inside the software. And so what you would do is download the ration and export it to an Excel sheet. And then in the Excel sheet, you would use that list of Sentinel foods that you added to add in the average price for the quantity of the commodity that you have added. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So you can see this is what it looked like when I exported my ration here, my illustrative ration into Excel. So here you have the grams per person per day. In the middle, I've demonstrated what was pre-existing in the MEB. So we're assuming that the woman or girl that's receiving this is going to they're going to get money for the GFA. So the general food assistance money is coming to their household, where they're going to buy a bunch of rice and maize meal and oil, and they're going to share that at the household level. And we're assuming that she's getting an equal portion of that. And then what else do we need to add, right? So we have the additives that we did along the normal categories. So for some things we added some rice, we added some beans, we added a lot more ground nuts, right? So like we did not add any extra oil, we didn't add any extra sugar, but we added some other things. And so then additionally, you will see what we added at the bottom, those extra nutrient dense foods that are going to be new foods that would be presumed in the value voucher basket, right? So we have our dark green leafy vegetables, we have fish, goat meat, oranges. And so here in the supplemental amount, you can see running all the way down what the amount of grams per person per day we've added with this supplemental basket, okay? And then we have the cost per 100 grams, and then we have the cost per day, and down at the bottom, that cost per day is added up and then multiplied by 30 to get the cost per month, the average cost per month. And so then this is the way that we've costed this basket. And so in order to cover 100% of the nutrient gap for a pregnant or breastfeeding woman or girl in Yum Yum land, using just a value voucher, not any other kind of intervention, we would need to provide them with 20,366 Yum Yums per month, alongside all of the appropriate messaging about how to use that value well, okay? So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So some considerations that I wanted to bring to you is that you can also use NutVal to look at what other nutrition interventions would add. Like you could use, you could say, what does the addition of a micronutrient supplement look like if we add that and presume that everybody in the population is getting access to that and is going to be able to take it. There's also the ability to add in a fortified blended food if you wanted to use that alongside cash to supplement. So you can sort of like pick and choose if you wanted to do a mixed modality intervention, and you could look at all of them and try to figure out what it would end up costing the program to do those things. So when you have your costed balance, you're able to design a program that includes a reasonable way to give participants access to the funds that they need for the nutritious foods. So you have to know how much you need to spend to figure out what's the right modality for it. Like, is it better to do a value voucher where you have vendors that are enrolled, or is it better to do cash, like from an ATM for this purpose? You also need to think about what are the nutrition messages that you need to provide to the person receiving the transfer and the community around them in order to make sure that those things are used appropriately. You might have to socialize husbands and fathers. You might have to socialize mother-in-laws who live in the house with. You might have to socialize vendors that, like, when people come in, if they have a restricted list of items they can purchase from, we really want them to buy from that and not just another bag of rice, because the goal of this is to improve the nutritional density of the diet. You also can think about designing your program to have other connections to other necessary services. Like, what does the connection to the health system look like? Do you use this as a platform for screening and referral for acute malnutrition management services? There's also an opportunity to include wash services here, either messages or maybe a cash transfer for a wash kit if needed. There's an opportunity to connect on child development outcomes. And then the final thing that you need to consider in designing the program after you've sort of established what you're going to do with this basket to meet the nutrient needs is you need to look at your monitoring, your price monitoring approach. If previously you've only monitored prices for like dry commodities in the market, you don't need to do much outside of that if you're only adding dry commodities to the basket. But if you add other fresh foods, it might be monitoring entirely different markets or different vendors. You might also have to consider what different vendors you need to include. Does a dry goods trader, do they source milk or not? Do they source fresh meat? Or do you have to enroll a new set of vendors to participate in your program to provide those items? What works best? So go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, that is my last slide, I believe. I think that we got through most of what had come up in previous webinars in terms of salient questions, but I'm also happy to answer whatever you put in the Q&A, and I will turn it back over to Andy now.
Many thanks, Maggie. And as you see, we've got another poll for you now. So our first question is, have you ever used NutVal in your work to calculate a CVA transfer value? And the possible answers are never, occasionally, or often. Yes, someone has pointed out in the chat that unfortunately the second question isn't appearing on the poll at the moment, but I'm afraid we may have to leave that one. But the question was going to be, was the approach that you used similar to that was presented by Maggie, or did you take a different approach to calculating the CVA transfer value for the nutritional component? So maybe we can just hold that, and perhaps you could comment on that in the chat, or we can have a look at that or discuss that when we get to the end and move to the Q&A session. Thank you. So we have about, I think we've got most of the responses in we're going to get. And as we can see, if we could share, as we've shared the results with you now, you see that the majority of people haven't used NutVal in your work to calculate a CVA transfer value. About 1 in 5 of us have used it occasionally, and about 1 in 10 of us have used it often for that purpose. And of course, as Maggie pointed out, there are quite a lot of constraints in using it currently, as you can only do part of your work in that tool. And so your workflow involves using NutVal, but using also spreadsheets and other information to do your calculation. So what I want to share with you now is the proposed, hopefully there'll be enhancements for the next version of NutVal, version 5. And we hope this will be out early next year. And it would be really great to get your feedback on this. So we're going to sort of share some of the proposed features with you, and then we're going to ask for some feedback in another poll, in the last poll. but we'll also then open it up for Q&A to get to more general questions and responses. Next slide, please. So just to emphasize that, unfortunately, NutVal 5 has been rather long in coming. We started thinking about this back in 2018 when we actually did an online poll. And just wanted to show that because it did really influence what NutVal 5 is looking like at the moment. So these feedbacks, polls that we get either online or through webinars like this are really helpful and do really influence the features that we then try and build into the software. Next slide, please. So what did we do, or what are we trying to do with the next version? So one thing that the users are always asking for is to increase the number of items in the NutVal food database. So there's about 188 items in the current one. And at the moment, we're looking to have probably about 230 items in the new ones. And a lot of the new items have actually been requested and also been provided by ICRC. So big thanks to them for their help in compiling those lists and pulling together the nutrient data that we're then working to include in NutVal version 5. So the second point, which is actually point 2, is that we wanted to make the nutritional requirements adjustable for all of the groups. So at the moment, you might remember in version 4, for the general ration requirement, you can increase or decrease the amount. So for example, you may decide, right, we want to design a program to deliver 70% of nutritional requirements because we think that the population is 30% food sufficient. So we don't need to supply them with everything, we just need to supply them with 70%. So that's for the general population, but in the new version at the moment, we're proposing that we can adjust that percentage requirement for all of the different population groups. So for example, for children, we would say, okay, how much food do we need to supply to meet 50% of their needs? Or as example shown on the slide, if it was for pregnant women, how much would we need to supply to meet 50% of the kilocalories for a pregnant woman? So that's a new feature. The third one is that we've added a ration requirement for people in detention, so prisoners of war or other people in detention. So very useful for organizations who are working in those contexts. The fourth thing is that we wanted to make the application more user-friendly for CVA, and that's obviously the focus of the seminar or the webinar today. And lastly, we wanted to try and retain the look and feel of the current version because a lot of the feedback we get suggests that people really like the simplicity and ease of use. Ideally, people should be able to pick up and use this tool without getting training. But that I think is going to become a little bit more tricky as we introduce more features. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give you a brief demonstration of the proposed features in the new version, and then ask for your feedback on those changes. And particularly, of course, because of the subject today, we're going to be focusing on the changes relating to the calculation of CVA transfer values. So Kate, I think that's brilliant. So I'm just going to now share my screen, and then hopefully we'll be able to share with you the current version of the prototype version of NutVal 5. So Diane, maybe you could just confirm you can see the screen okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so as you can see, it looks pretty similar. And if we go back to look at the energy and macronutrients and minerals, we can see that the screen up to this point is pretty much the same as it is in version 4. There's a few differences. So you might have noticed there's this 100% thing down here. And that's because we can now, as I mentioned, adjust the percentage requirements for all of the different requirements. And as we go up and down, you can see how far away we are from 100%. So if we reduce it, say, okay, we're now at 99%, we see I have a little up arrow which tells us actually we would need to increase that to get back to 100%. So if we are aiming to adjust our values, then this is a helpful sort of reminder of where we are in terms of 100%. So that's, I'll just go back now to the general population. As you can see, we have a ration requirement for 2,100 kilocalories. Okay, but what's new over here is that we now have cost columns for food transfers and cash transfers. And we also have a drop down here, which allows us to select the currency that we may want to work with. So for today, I'm just going to leave it at euros. But where does that cost data come from? Well, that cost data has to come from you. There is no built-in cost database. And the reason is that there's going to be great variations locally and over time as well. So for example, you probably, some of you are aware of the food security assessment that WFP have done just in the last, or published in the last few days on Gaza, where we're seeing massive inflation in food costs due to the blockade. And so in a humanitarian context, and it may be not necessarily due to conflict, but due to seasonality, the price data may be changing very rapidly. So that's why we haven't tried to build in any indicative costs. Rather, we have this screen here where you can enter your own. So let me just take you through that. Over here, we have columns for entering the costs if we're doing a food transfer. And that would include the price, the procurement cost per kilo, the external transport, which is usually international transport, and this thing over here, which is called landside transport, storage, and handling. And if you're not quite sure what, or forget, like me, what these acronyms mean, there's a little green circle now, and you can just point to that, and it will come up with a little help box. So these terminologies here are the ones that are used by WFP and are common in logistics. So as you can see at the moment, for example, for wheat, we have a procurement cost, we have an international or external transport costs, but we don't have any costs for landside transport, storage, and handling. And of course, there will be some costs. So let's just pretend at the moment we're gonna put in a unit of 1. And all of these costs are not intended in any way to be accurate, they're just for illustration purposes. So if we put the cost in there, you can see then that the total cost per kilo would have increased up to €3 per kilo in this hypothetical example. And over here, we see that the food transfer cost per person per day has gone up here to 1.35. Now, as we increase the amount that we are allocating to that person, you'll see that obviously that the cost will go up over here. But today we're focusing on CVA. So I'm actually going to delete these figures here so we can then just focus on the cash transfer price. And one really important thing is that we don't want people to use this tool to compare the costs of food transfers and cash transfers because the calculations are not equivalent. For cash transfer, we don't, for example, include any allocation for the transactional cost of doing the cash distribution, whereas there are costs in here for transporting the food. So please note that this calculation is not equivalent and should not be compared to the cash transfer calculation. Okay, so in this case, now focusing on the cash transfer price, we can see in this example, we're assuming that the cost per kilo for wheat is €1. And that's the retail cost. That's really important because people, when they have their cash transfer, either as a voucher or as cash, whether that's physical cash or electronic cash, they're going to buy usually from a retailer, not a wholesaler. So we have to use retail prices, and that should be collected from the best sources of market data we have. But of course, during the course of a program, we expect there to be at least some degree of price fluctuation. And that's what's built in the next column, which is our assumption about inflation. So here we're assuming that over the course of our program, whether that's 3 months or perhaps 12 months, there will be 10% inflation. And therefore the average cost is adjusted upwards to allow for that inflation here. Now, of course, if we started during the lean season where prices are high, we might expect there would actually be a decrease in cost, in the average cost of the retail purchase over the course of the program. So we might say, okay, we actually expect over the course of the program that the costs will be 5% lower. There will be negative inflation or deflation. So you can build it in either way. But let's just go back to what we had there. So this then provides the cash transfer price per person based on the price, the retail price per kilo, and our assumptions about inflation. And for each of those, then we have a price, and this is totaled up at the bottom, which in this case comes to this hypothetical example, cost of 8.2 euros per person per day in this rather expensive economy. Okay, so once we put prices in, we can see in this example, for example, that we have super cereal. And I've included that here. And maybe we think, actually, we shouldn't really include the price because we are assuming that would be distributed through a complementary or a blanket supplementary feeding program. So we could actually maybe take out that cost and we wouldn't need to cover that in our cash transfer. But here, for green leafy vegetables, we see we haven't actually included any costs at all. So we need to add that. So one thing you can do in NutVal now is to load cost data that you may have saved. So that's reloaded that, which we didn't want. I'm going to delete this over here so we don't get distracted by it. But for the spinach, dark green leafy vegetables, we don't have a price. So let's just assume that we've got prices from the market and it's 2 euros, and we're expecting there to be some level of inflation, which we're assuming is going to be 5%. So then we then have a estimated cash transfer price that we need to build into our cash transfer calculation to allow for the purchase of dark green leafy vegetables. Once we've completed our price data and we're happy with it, we can then save that. And that overwrites any data that we may have saved previously. And then if I delete that, just show we can then reload it as we wish. There we go. Okay, so that's how we can then directly cost the potential cash CVA amount. Now, of course, one thing that we may want to do is change our ration. And as I mentioned in NutVal 4, and it works the same way in NutVal 5, we can select our items here. And we can also copy them from the food database. Say we wanted to have that. We can copy from the food database and just paste in here as well. So let's say, okay, we're going to add another 20 beans there. And then we'd obviously need to put in some price data here. So that's the basic process by which we can take our nutritionally designed ration. So if we go back here, this is the ration that we're working with. We can look at how well this ration or this food basket meets our energy, protein, macronutrient, and mineral requirements. We can look at how well it meets our vitamin requirements. As we see, we still have some problems here. And then we can enter cost data here and come up with a cash transfer amount. Now, of course, one of the problems that people have is that sometimes the food items that are in the NutVal database don't include the ones that we want. So sometimes we may wish to add other foods here. So that's what this space down here is for. The food items that you can't find in the NutVal database, you can then enter there. So perhaps food, other other food 1. So this might be a local food that you just can't find and it's important, so you put it in there. And then you may put in your amounts here. And if you were looking for the nutritional adequacy, you would then have to put these amounts in yourself, either as simple values or as formula. So you could then adjust the amount here, but you would need to put those in yourself. And when it comes to the costs, you of course would also need to add in the costs here. So let's say that's 1 and we're expecting 2% inflation. Now, that is therefore a way that you can get to the values or a cash transfer estimate if the items that you need to include are not included in the database. But of course, we're often dealing in a situation where cash transfers are multi-purpose cash transfers, or maybe part of an MEB expenditure calculation. So there's one other feature that possibly we may add in, which is to include the ability to add non-food items into this cash calculation. Let's take those out to start with. So for example, in an MEB calculation, there may be a value that's required for shelter. There may be a value required for water. And there you can there also put the price of these things in. And you can again add some inflation assumptions that you may wish to make for those items. At the moment, you can see that the value over here is 0 because you need to put here, then you need to enter a 1. If you are calculating this per household, then that would be just as a 1. But if you're doing it per person, then you could then put here the number of the average household size. So for example, if these were calculated the shelter costs per person and your average household size was 5, you could then come up with your final cash transfer value, which of course here is very expensive, but these are simply for illustration purposes. So that's a potential other function that we might want to include if people thought it was useful to extend the calculation to look at other items that might be included in the minimum expenditure basket. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now, and Kate, back to you. And next slide, please. Great, so we now have our last Zoom poll, which I think Sandra is about to share with you. So it'd be great to get your feedback on some of those features or potential features that we've just demonstrated for you there to see how valuable or not you think they might be for your work. So again, for our translators, I'll read out the questions. The first is, or rather, all of these questions are related to the key question, which is, do you think that the following proposed updates related to CVA transfer calculations will be useful? And the first proposed update is the ability to enter, save, and recall costs of foods. And the options are not useful, occasionally useful, or very useful. The second question is it useful to include inflation in the calculation of CVA food transfer values? And the options again are not useful, occasionally useful, and very useful. Question 3 is it useful in NutVal And I didn't really show you that very much in the demonstration, but there is a calculator which allows you to scale up the individual transfer values to a program calculation. So would it be useful to include the CVA and food transfer program calculators to allow for that to happen? Not useful, occasionally useful, or very useful. Question 4 is, were the cost categories that were included in the calculator appropriate? Or are there other cost categories that should be included in the calculator? So remember, we had retail cost and inflation for cash transfers, and we had price, the external transport, and the LTSH cost for food transfers. Are there other cost categories that should be included in the calculator? Yes, no, or not sure. And finally, would you like a way to include non-food items in the calculation of cash transfer amounts? So I showed the examples of where we might want to build in, for example, shelter costs into an MEB calculation so we could see everything together. Would it be useful to have that feature in NutVal, or is that better done in a different tool? So would you like a way to include it in NutVal? Yes, no, or not sure? Okay, I think we've got most of the responses that are going to come in. Sanjay, would you like to end the poll? And oh, we just got a couple more. Okay, there we go. Here are our results. Good. So just to run through them, it seemed that the 74% thought it'd be useful to be able to save and recall costs. 22% occasionally useful. People generally thought that it's good to build in an inflation into the calculation. And the program transfer calculators were thought to be useful. And we had quite a few people saying that there are other cost categories that should be included in the calculator. So it'd be great to explore that a bit more in the Q&A or or the actual questions. And finally, would you like a way to include non-food items in the calculation of cash transfer amounts within NutVal? And there we have, yeah, more of a bit more of a match, but a clear majority saying that they think they would. So thanks very much, Sanjay, for sharing that. And next slide, please. So I think I'm going to hand over to Marina.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Very, very interesting presentations and case studies, which raise the attentions of our audience today. We have many questions. I am gonna start to read some of them, and I think many of them are for you, Andy. So the first question is about the possibility to embed or insert an Excel worksheet into the NutVal, is it possible someone has tried to insert directly an Excel sheet, I presume with a food basket, into the NutVal software? I wanted to try to work around the nutritional adequacy. They said it didn't work, they couldn't do it. Is there any workaround? I don't know if the question is clear.
Yeah, no, sure. I don't think there is. I don't fully understand what you were trying to do there, but I don't think there is, because NutVal is a spreadsheet with macros built in. So if you were to sort of include it in another spreadsheet, I don't think it's unlikely that it would continue to work as you intended it, I think.
Thank you, Andy. And the question was from Yuten G. So if you want to come off mute and come back to this question to provide more clarification, feel free to come off mute. The following question, so there were few questions on the, transfer value. I think I wanted to share a message with our audience today. Many questions around the nutritional adequacy of the existing food basket and how the NutVal can be used if the food basket and the value of the food basket is usually standard for the food security cluster. So what are the ways to play around it? And there was a question around the cash and voucher transfer value. I just wanted to clarify that the modality doesn't change. I mean, all these calculations that we're showing today would apply either if we choose to use vouchers or cash, and it's really the feasibility and risk analysis that will tell you what's the best modality. And yeah, another comment on the transfer value. I think Maggie's example was showing how we can improve nutritional adequacy of an existing food basket, and it's really our job also to discuss with the actors if we think it's not nutritionally adequate to improve some of these micronutrient composition, even if at the moment is not really appropriate. Or the other way around could be to use the NutVal to design a top-up assistance, right? To just bringing in this nutritional adequacy for the individuals that we were presenting, pregnant and breastfeeding women and children under 2. You can design a top-up with what was presented today. So Andy, there is a question for you on the micronutrient. What standards does a NutVal follow for micronutrients? When I've used it, I found that it does not align with the USDA standards for several of the micronutrients.
No, thanks for that. It's a good point. The requirements are calculated based on the latest WHO requirement reports. They are adjusted. For example, when you calculate the requirement for the planning figure of 2,100 kilocalories, it has to assume a basic demographic profile. So we published a paper a while ago for work we did for CVA to actually calculate the nutrient requirements for that. So if you have a look in the current version of NutVal, in the help screen, there's references which detail where those figures are coming from. And also I saw there's a question about the food database, and similarly, most of that comes from USDA. Some of it comes from West African food sources. Some of it comes from WHO publications. But the sources are listed in the help section within the NutVal program.
Thanks a lot. The following question, I think, is related to the last example that you showed. So there was a question about the inflation rate. How was the inflation rate determined?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm not sure if we have any economists in the audience, but we all know how difficult it is for even expert economists to predict what inflation is going to do, and they generally get it wrong. So just to think, imagine you were in a position, hopefully no one is in a position of thinking about doing a cash transfer in Gaza, but if they were, for example, we know the inflation rate on some commodities has been like 200%, and on others it's 50%. So what would you assume the inflation would be over a 3-month period? It's no easy answers. You have to come up with an assumption, but in a situation where you have supply constraints, there's always going to be some level of inflation, and sometimes it can be very high. But it's really up to you, up to the users to come up with a consensus estimate of what you expect that inflation to be, bearing in mind it will be likely different for different commodities.
Yeah, and I have a very frequent market monitoring. I think the cash working group is really trying to bring as much information as possible as a community.
Yeah, maybe just to add, it's better to have some assumption than no assumption. Yeah, you can't just ignore it, or you shouldn't just be ignoring it. You have to at least think about it.
Yeah, and decide at a certain point if you want a shifting commodity. That's why it's super important to follow the market. The following question, I'm not sure if I understand it perfectly, but I think it's about an acronym that you were using. Is LTSH the same thing as ISTH?
I guess if someone could tell me what ISTH was, I might be able to hazard a guess.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, if Mara, you want to come off mute and explain, we are happy to take further the question. Meanwhile, there was a question from Zainab. Can you please demonstrate how to enter a formula for the nutritional value of foods that we have to enter manually, and how that changes when we adjust the quantity?
Yeah, sure. So the basic principle would be that you could put a formula in based on the nutrient value per 100 grams. And of course, I think someone wanted me to make the point that, as with most food composition tables and analysis, we're talking about 100 grams of raw edible portion. That's the sort of the standard way that foods are presented in most food composition tables, and that's what we've used in NutVal. But you would put in the value for 100 grams of raw edible portion, and then for each, say, for example, calcium, and then you could then set up a formula. So when you adjusted the quantity and the number of grams, that would then automatically adjust the amount of nutrient. Or you could simply decide in advance, right, we're going to have 50 grams of this food, and therefore we will have X amount of calcium. But you can put a formula in, so it will automatically adjust as you would put in another Excel formula into other spreadsheets.
Great, thank you so much. I think there is there is a question that is in French, so I'm going to try to translate it in English. There's no name, so the person that was writing the question, feel free to come off mute. The question is about the example, I think is the example that Maggie was showing. And he's asking how can we update the column for the MEB. I think that's the question. Comment pourrons-nous renseigner la colonne MEB dans les tableaux Yum Yum? si la personne en ligne si peut expliquer un peu mieux la question, on peut essayer de répondre. I don't know, Maggie, if you have any idea on the answer to this question.
I can guess, and then they can write in the chat and tell me if I'm getting at it. So in my example, when we were talking about adding more commodity to what was already in the MEB, the cost that we were calculating for that top-up value was for those additional commodities. So for a pregnant woman, they, in addition to needing like micronutrient rich foods like green leafy vegetables and some sort of animal source protein and that kind of stuff, they also just need more calories, and they need more of the essential vitamins and minerals that are in those common like staple foods like beans and rice and maize and oil. They need extra fat in their diet, right? And so we didn't have to add, for some of those nutrient needs, we didn't need to add, in our assumptions, we didn't need to add other foods. We just needed to add more of the same foods. So the MEB estimation stays the same, right? So like we just added the costs for what we needed additional in those same food categories to the overall cost of that basket. So we only costed what was added. And so in that slide that showed the Excel export and how I costed the basket, that MEB column was showing what's already there so that we could make sure we only costed what was extra in the basket for those categories of food, like the rice and peanuts and beans and those kinds of things. Is that what you were looking for? I hope that helped.
Yeah, feel free to share more insights in the chat box if you want. We are 3 minutes close to the end of the webinar. So I'm gonna take one of the two hands that are up. Miri Alemu, you can go first. I hope I pronounced well your name. Mihiret Alemo, if you want to ask the question, you have the floor. Okay, so maybe we can give the floor to Mara in the while. Mara Russell, I see your hand up. You can ask.
Okay, if you can hear me, my question is LSTH, which is a term that WFP uses for transportation within a country, transportation, storage, and handling within a country, the same thing as ITSH, which is used by the US government, which stands for Internal Transport, Storage, and Handling, which is, I believe, the same thing. I just want to make sure that the two of them are equivalent, if anyone knows.
It certainly sounds the same, but Maggie is from the US government, so over to you.
Yeah. So the ISTH would include the international shipping.
No,
costs?
it doesn't. No.
The
Just
ISTH?
internal ISTH is internal.
Oh, you
The
mean
I
it's
stands for
after it
internal.
arrives at the
Yes,
port?
yes.
Yeah, so then it's
So-
the same.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide and we can start to close this session. Mihiret, feel free to ask your question in the Q&A box. Thanks so much for your participation. I think it was a very interesting webinar again that gave us the opportunity to really walk through the use of the NutVal. So many useful considerations about the transfer value, about the food ratio, about how to really navigate the software. We are, I would like to remind you that we are the Cash and Voucher Working Group, one of the groups of the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance, and we provide support if needed, different type of support. So don't hesitate if you want to work more on the use of CVA to approach the GNC. You can receive remote or in-country technical support according to the request, and you can really reach out to the GNC team. In some cases, we can help you to hire a consultant, but also to have a quick technical advice as needed. And feel free to use the ENNet website if you want to request a peer support. Next slide, please. We are gonna ask you, we would be very pleased for you to take a survey that is gonna come at the end of this webinar. Remember that you have lots of resources and information, including the presentation and the recording of this webinar in many languages in the GNC cluster website and the Alliance. So feel free to fill the form if you require any technical support, as it is displayed in this slide. Next slide, please. And we would be very pleased if you can take 5 minutes to participate into the survey. We're going to use the funding of the survey to tailor our next webinars and work around the use of the NutVal for the NutVal practitioners. Thanks again. Thanks a lot to the presenters. Thanks a lot to the interpreters. Thanks really a lot to the Global Nutrition Cluster team, which helped us to organize this series of webinars. I remind you, this is the last of 3 webinars on the use of NutVal and cost of the diet in the design of the CVA. So don't miss the resources. Go on the GNC website to follow where these resources will be posted. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. And I think we can close the webinar.